According to at least one survey, the 3 most unpopular dungeons in Ocarina of Time are all, in some way, water-themed. The dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly, the water temple, and the ice cavern. The ice cavern, despite my own affection for it, is rather slight and has a few irritating mechanics, so I wasn't surprised to see that it was unpopular. The water temple, meanwhile, is infamous for how disliked it is, even if its reputation has improved over the years as people have learned to appreciate its complexity. The unambiguous unpopularity of the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly did surprise me, however.
I suppose I had expected it to be carried by its theming, which is certainly among the strongest of any dungeon in the Legend of Zelda series. Offer a fish to this big whale known as Lord Jabu-Jabu, the patron deity of the fish-like Zora people, and he'll open up his big gob to swallow the offering up, sucking up Link in the process. Once inside, you find that his innards are arranged in the conveniently explorable shape of a dungeon, only with walls made of red and pink organ tissue instead of bricks. Now, this theming isn't unique to Ocarina of Time. Plenty of video games have sections involving exploring the innards of some creature, but it is a striking theme regardless, and it's expressed well here. The walls and floors have a fleshy color and have been given various undulating, color-shifting visual effects that suggest breathing, blood flow, digestion, or whatever other sorts of movements happen beneath the skin. The walls make a gross noise and bleed when struck by Link's sword. Instead of doors, rooms are separated by what I can really only refer to as sphincters. Instead of being blocked by metal bars, these sphincter doors are blocked by a sort of web-like membrane, maybe intended to resemble what is referred to by butchers as caul fat, also known by the anatomical term greater omentum. The biological theming runs deeper than some visual effects and weird-looking doors, though. The entrance room, where you can see the back of Lord Jabu-Jabu's teeth and his ridged palate, is obviously his mouth, but after that point, the whole dungeon is made up of tube-like hallways and squirming cavities, resembling organs that are evocative of anatomy without ever being so gauche as to tell you when you're in, say, the intestines of Lord Jabu-Jabu. Instead of mechanical switches, there are these yellow things. The ones that rise up from the ground, activated by standing on them, have a more flat, rounded shape and resemble a kind of pustule. The ones that hang from the ceiling, activated by being hit with a projectile, have an elongated shape and vaguely resemble the uvula, the structure that Cardi B referred to as the little dangly thing in the back of her throat. It's a simple thing, but I appreciate how strongly the yellow of these switches stands out from the bright red background. I also appreciate the way the aberrant shapes and inflamed colors of the parasitic tentacles and the floppy muscle platforms invite the player's attention in a slightly more subtle way. Those are good examples of how the general squishiness of this dungeon doesn't come at the expense of visual readability, at least on the scale of individual challenges. But the dungeon is a bit lacking in overall visual variety, so it can be difficult to orient yourself. There are at least 2 rooms that are laid out in a way that is, if not literally symmetrical, close enough to symmetrical that I regularly forget which side of the room that I'm on. This is particularly problematic because the process of exploring the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly is much more convoluted than it was in the 2 dungeons that preceded it, and I think this is the root of what frustrates people about this dungeon.
Even if it took me a while to play Ocarina of Time to completion, I was pretty young when I first finished the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly, so I have a hard time remembering how it felt to approach it for the first time, especially when I've spent the past almost 3 years deeply immersed in this game, becoming very familiar with every dungeon. So take what I say with a grain of salt, because it has been a long time since this particular dungeon has thrown me for a loop.
Nevertheless, I think I can see why it's confusing. First, for the reasons of visual variety listed above. This works in combination with other factors. instead of having a single visually distinct hub room at the dungeon's center, as there was in Dodongo's Cavern and the dungeon inside the Deku Tree, the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly has a vaguely defined center, comprised of 2 open cavity rooms and a third room that is more of a branching hallway. Progression through the dungeon consists of a few phases. For the first phase, when the dungeon is initially being explored, many of the dungeon's rooms on both of its floors are available, but there is no clear center point until you acquire the dungeon's main item, the boomerang. At this point, the branching hallway room becomes the dungeon's center. The branching hallway room is made distinctive by its harsher color scheme and the way its floors gently push Link towards one of the 5 exits. The first of these 5 exits is where Link acquires the boomerang. The map and compass are found in 2 of the remaining rooms, providing some much needed clarity to exploration, albeit only after the player has had ample opportunity to get lost. Up to this point, the player may have encountered the red, blue, and green barriers, which Navi refers to as the red, blue, and green slimy things, which damage Link on contact and prevent him from accessing certain rooms. In order to get rid of those barriers, you have to defeat the red, blue, and green parasitic tentacle enemies, which reside in 3 circular arenas connected to the branching hallway room. This means then that the branching hallway room is a one and done kind of affair. As soon as you can acquire the boomerang, it's as simple as defeating all 3 of the parasitic tentacles in sequence. At that point, the center of the dungeon shifts to the room right before the branching hallway room, a pretty indistinct looking rectangular room with some holes in the ground. These holes are a big sticking point for this dungeon, I think. Each one of them leads to a different landing point on the floor below, but the holes have a visual effect that prevents you from seeing where you'll be landing. Moreover, the holes aren't given any sort of distinction from each other than their position in the room, a room which, as I mentioned earlier, is visually indistinct and mostly symmetrical, so it's difficult to keep track of which of the 5 holes you have and haven't tested out. The only visual distinction, in fact, is one of the parasitic tentacle barriers, a green slimy thing. As soon as you make the connection that defeating the parasitic tentacles will clear the barriers, hopefully you'll be able to intuit that the way forward is down the hole covered by the green barrier, because otherwise you won't have any leads on how to find the path forward. Because this green barrier is the only thing setting that hole apart, once you defeat the green parasitic tentacle and the barrier disappears, the hole that you need to go to loses the only feature that sets it apart from any other hole. So you have to either remember which hole was covered up by a green slimy thing in a room that now completely lacks distinguishing features, or figure it out through trial and error, which in this case means falling into a hole and slowly climbing back out of the hole until you've checked every hole. And every time you do this, all of the enemies in the room respawn. They're all big floating jellyfish monsters. The little ones are called Biri and the big ones are called Bari. They give Link a painful looking incapacitating shock if they make contact with him, or if he hits them with his sword. They're immune to being hit with slingshot bullets, so you have to use the much slower boomerang, your limited supply of Deku sticks, or a spin attack to deal with them. I kind of like how mean these enemies feel, and I like how their harsh electric blue coloring and the way they appear in groups conveys the feeling of an infestation. But their aggressive respawning makes the already tedious trial and error process of testing out the various holes all the more frustrating. Anyway, once you've figured out the correct hole, the next task is dealing with the dungeon's mini-boss, the Big Octo. This fight takes place in a small, donut-shaped arena with spikes lining the inner edge. The Big Octo runs in one direction, and you have to hit it in the big glowing cloaca on its back. The Big Octo runs at almost exactly the same speed as you, so in order to chase it down from behind, you have to run as close to the inner edge as possible without getting grazed by the spikes, while making careful use of Link's rolling, which is marginally faster than his running, but harder to control. Or you can stand in one place and time your boomerang throws really well. Or you can just let the Big Octo ram into you, at which point it turns around, exposing its weak point. The elements of a good fight are here, I think, but they don't feel like they come together in a balanced way. The correct ways of doing the fight are tedious, so there's a strong temptation to just let the big guy hit you you so you can get an easier hit. Still, it's expressing a mechanical idea in a clear way, and I give it points for that. I also give it points for being a mini-boss that you can easily defeat in one hit, a jump attack with a Deku stick. That's not a backhanded compliment either. I love all the little tricks that you can pull off in Ocarina of Time, moments where a little bit of knowledge goes a long way. Anyway, after the big Octo is a brief, simple puzzle involving using the boomerang to stun these weird, muscular structures so you can use them as platforms, at which point you are one, hold down the switch with a box puzzle, and one, hit the switch by throwing your boomerang in just the right way puzzle, away from fighting this dungeon's cool, dramatic boss fight. The bioelectric anemone, Barinade, is some kind of freakish parasitic organ covered in blue jellyfish. The fight consists of avoiding blasts of lightning from Barinade's tendrils, and avoiding the jellyfish as they spin around so you can stun the boss, which then allows you to get rid of its jellyfish goons, and eventually open up the boss to be attacked directly. The boss arena itself lacks any obvious visual drama like you had with the fog in Queen Goma's room or the lava pit in King Dodongo's room, but Barinade more than makes up for it in terms of audiovisual chaos. There are way more moving parts here than there are in most other boss fights in this game, and the crackling sound of lightning, the whooshing sound of spinning jellyfish, and a bunch of other noises from various other sources all combine with the bombastic fight music into a complete cacophony. Compared to the two preceding boss fights, there is a much more profound sense of relief when it's all over.
That is about all I intend to say about this dungeon's boss and mini-boss. My point is to illustrate how much more difficult this dungeon is along every axis than the two dungeons preceding it. It's more confusing to explore, it's trickier to navigate, and its combat is more punishing. And this is all happening before the player has gotten important upgrades, like more health, a better sword, or better ranged options. I think that does a lot to explain this dungeon's unpopularity.
I wouldn't just attribute it to difficulty though. The dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly is definitely a jump in difficulty after the very simple Dodongo's cavern, but going from the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly to the forest temple is a much bigger jump in difficulty, and the forest temple is, according to at least one survey, the most popular dungeon in the game. There is probably a sense of restlessness, as the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly is the last obstacle before obtaining the Master Sword and becoming an adult. Who wants to waste their time digging in the guts of some fish when a cool sword is within sight? Of course, one of the biggest factors that annoys people about this dungeon is one that I haven't even mentioned yet: the Zora princess, Ruto. When you arrive in the indistinct looking room with the holes in the ground, you encounter Princess Ruto, King Zora's daughter, who had gone missing after being sent to make an offering to Lord Jabu-Jabu. She scoffs at the idea that you could help her, and proceeds to immediately fall into a hole into the room below. You follow her down and talk to her. She rebuffs you again. You talk to her again, and she relents, granting you the privilege of carrying her around. She's a character who is deliberately written to annoy the player. First, there is her refusal to accept help. She even goes as far as to question your manhood if you leave her behind. Eventually, you get rid of her, and can complete the rest of the dungeon alone, but that's only because she ran off with the spiritual stone that you were trying to find, and immediately got captured by the dungeon's boss afterward, forcing you to rescue her. But from a mechanical standpoint, she is intended to be helpful. You can't proceed through the dungeon without using her weight to hold down two of the switches found in the branching hallways room, and you can even throw her at monsters and hanging switches if you want to conserve slingshot bullets. The way Princess Ruto is implemented as a mechanic is imperfect though. There are 3 points on the bottom floor where she can be submerged in water. Being that she's a fish girl, you would think this would be fine, but in fact, being submerged causes her to disappear. Don't panic. She reappears at one of 2 locations if this happens, so you can simply backtrack a little and carry her with you again. But this unavoidable unavoidably feels strange. First, that putting her in water would be a problem, and second, that the locations where she reappears simply aren't signaled to the player at all. And moreover, it's annoying having to backtrack to retrieve her. I wonder if there's some technical or design reason why she doesn't reappear at the room's entrance like Link does when he falls into a bottomless pit. I mentioned that Princess Ruto can reappear in one of two locations, and that ties into a slightly broader problem with her mechanical implementation. Even if the time that players spend with her is ultimately pretty brief, the way she operates is noticeably inconsistent. When you first start carrying her, if she needs to reappear, she reappears in a room on the bottom floor. Then, once you've brought her back up to the first floor, if she needs to reappear, she reappears in the indistinct looking room with the holes in the ground. Most of the time, you aren't supposed to leave a room without carrying her. But one of the rooms at the end of the branching hallways can only be opened if you're using her to hold down a floor switch. When you exit that room, she's right there where you left her. But I am willing to overlook her little inconsistencies, because I think she adds some interesting narrative and mechanical texture, and she's a big part of what I find so forward-looking about this dungeon. Despite how limited her abilities are, being that she mostly amounts to a paperweight that insults you, she's an early attempt at creating a companion character to follow the player through a dungeon. Previous Legend of Zelda games had made some loose gestures towards this. You can rescue a child in Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, but he stays tucked safely away in the player's inventory until they bring him back to his mother. A Link to the Past features a section early on where you escort Princess Zelda to a safe house, then a section later in the game where you have to escort a non-suspicious maiden through a dungeon, and a few miscellaneous escorts besides those two. But in all of these escort missions, the mechanical impact of having a travel companion is minimal. They simply follow Link's every move. Finally, Link's Awakening, the game that most immediately preceded Ocarina of Time, has a few examples. There's a section where the player is responsible for taking a vaguely dog-like creature called a Bow Wow on a walk. The Bow Wow gobbles up enemies and certain obstacles, and grants the player access to the game's second dungeon. Then there's a sequence where Link goes on a date with a local girl. She follows his steps just like the people you escorted in A Link to the Past, but she provides more colorful commentary than they did. A little while after that, Link's Awakening provides us with the companion character whose role most closely resembles Princess Ruto's role in the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly. Well, it's not really a character so much as it is an iron ball that you have to carry around throughout an entire dungeon in order to solve various puzzles. Carrying around Princess Ruto is by no means revolutionary then. She's simply an evolution of a concept explored by previous games in the series. But the series would continue to experiment with this concept after Ocarina of Time, with almost every single subsequent game in the series featuring at least one dungeon with escort mechanics. In fact, all of the main dungeons in 2023's Tears of the Kingdom prominently feature a companion character. This is clearly an aspect of the series that the developers are interested in playing around with.
Unfortunately, Princess Ruto has a pretty big connection to another major recurring element of the Legend of Zelda series, and that is its weird treatment of women and girls. The first two Legend of Zelda games tasked you with rescuing a princess. A Link to the Past tasked you with rescuing a princess and like 6 other girls. All pretty standard objectification. Ocarina of Time is much more multifaceted. This isn't to say that Ocarina of Time is any more nuanced, though. Just that its objectification is more varied and far-reaching than it was in previous games in the series.
We still have to rescue Princess Zelda, for example, but now we see her get captured after being given tantalizing glimpses of her having more agency as the ninja Sheik. Or we have Malin, a nice farm girl who has fallen into the role of nagging her father to fulfill his responsibilities. We also have Saria, Link's green-haired bestie who, despite being the subject of some well-staged, emotionally evocative scenes, isn't really afforded any interiority beyond the fact that there's a specific stump that she likes sitting on. There are also the Gerudo Thieves, whose aggressive sexuality and fickle relationship with Link are tinged with misogyny, while also being a textbook example of an ignorant depiction of Middle Eastern, North African, and South Asian cultures. Yes, Princess Ruto adds some narrative and mechanical flavor to the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly. Looked at in isolation, it's funny the way she makes you carry her around. It's funny that she's objectified in an almost literal sense, being that she's treated like any other object in the game that you can pick up and throw around. It's funny that she's so clearly helpless without Link, and that she's so rude to him regardless. But looked at within the context of the rest of the game, we find a pattern. Most of the women and girls in this game are written in a limited, stereotypical, and objectifying way. So the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly is forward-looking in the sense that, through Princess Ruto, it showcases the series' increasing unfortunate reliance on sexist tropes. Indeed, the series still has yet to shake off these tropes, or Orientalist tropes for that matter. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are not, on the whole, any better than Ocarina of Time in this regard, even if their depiction of the Gerudo people is a little bit more complicated. The Legend of Zelda series plays into sexism and Orientalism. We have no reason to expect that to change, in the same way we have no reason to expect the series to suddenly revert from 3 dimensions back to 2 dimensions and stay there for the next decade. Nuanced depictions of women and other cultures simply aren't things that the developers seem interested in playing around with. Not the same way they're clearly interested in playing around with, say, different mechanical approaches to companion characters. In the face of all of what I just said about social issues, if you can still compel yourself to care about mechanical experimentation, I do think there's some worthwhile game design happening here. The early sequences of Ocarina of Time, before the player acquires the Master Sword, herald a change that would come with the rest of the 3D Legend of Zelda games. Later dungeons would come to rely less on literal locks and keys than the dungeons in the 2D entries. Like the 2 dungeons preceding it, the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly features no keys, so it has to gate the player's progress through other methods. First, it sends the player on a mini-adventure, getting Princess Ruto back up to the first floor, so she can help you weigh down some switches in the room with the branching hallways. Then you're granted the boomerang, which allows you to open up the rest of the dungeon. The dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly is the first dungeon in Ocarina of Time to feature a design idea that is central to a lot of the best Legend of Zelda dungeons. You do something in one room that affects another room. In this case, it's pretty simple. Destroy a parasitic tentacle, and the accompanying barrier in another room also disappears. Even if it's simple, this cause and effect relationship is satisfying and evocative on its own. I've talked multiple times about my concept of how dungeons exist in the player's brain, and this is a great example of how you can make the process of thinking about a dungeon more interesting by making an important change happen off-screen. In that respect, I think it makes a certain amount of sense the way the path forward is obscured. If the hole that was blocked by the green slimy thing was set apart from the other holes in any particular way, it might make the path forward too obvious. Rather than being driven by an understanding of how the dungeon works, the player would be driven by an understanding that they have to seek out the hole that looks different from the others.
For all the confusion wrought by that indistinct room with the holes in the floor, it's in service of making a dungeon that truly tests the player's understanding of 3D navigation and the way all the elements of a dungeon fit together. Understanding the way the upper level and lower level connect, and the way that your actions in one room will affect the paths available to you in other rooms is made much more challenging and potentially more interesting by the player's limited perspective. You can't simply rely on the game providing intuitive, clear visual information. You have to construct your own understanding of the space. If that sounds compelling to you, then congratulations. You have a good mindset for appreciating some of the more polarizing dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series. Which brings us along to the Water Temple.
The Water Temple has a well-earned reputation for being the most difficult, frustrating part of Ocarina of Time. You wouldn't be able to tell based on its theming alone. The dungeon is all cool blues, yellows, and browns, suggesting a serene, beach-like atmosphere. But moving past the basics of the color scheme, the dungeon's compounding complexities soon start to reveal themselves. As soon as you enter the dungeon, you catch sight of the central room with the mostly submerged tower in its center. None of the rooms on this top level are accessible, so you don the iron boots and sink below, getting introduced to the dungeon's overall structure, where you have to navigate between the central tower and the various rooms that line the outer walls of the dungeon. You make your way to the room on the east side of the dungeon's bottom level, and have a quick reunion with Princess Ruto. Now, she's 7 years older than she was the last time you met her, but she's still deeply in love with you, of course. She directs you to float up to the top level of this room, where you'll encounter the first of 3 panels that change the dungeon's water level to one of 3 levels. As you entered the dungeon for the first time, the water was at its highest level. At this first panel, you can lower the water to its lowest level. The 3 water levels grant and restrict access to the various parts of the dungeon, and figuring out when to change the water level is the dungeon's primary challenge. I think that this central challenge is expressed very well. It's all built around intuitive, understandable forces. Sometimes you gotta use bombs or light a torch, but you can't do that if you're underwater, so you gotta lower the water level. Some platforms float up when the water level goes up, that kind of thing. The dungeon gives all the tools necessary for understanding it right from the start. That initial descent in the central room with the tower gives you a preview of the entire dungeon's layout. There's a big room with a tower in the center, and it's surrounded by rooms that radiate out in the 4 cardinal directions. The 4 wings have varying levels of internal complexity, but they're completely separate from one another, so they can be more easily compartmentalized. You also get the map and compass much earlier than you would in other dungeons, relatively speaking, but the map isn't especially helpful for showing the layout of the dungeon, as it doesn't show the vertical connections that are so critical for navigation. The map is only really useful in conjunction with the compass, as the 2 of them together allow you to keep track of the remaining treasure chests with a vague idea of where to go to find them.
All of this information is something of a double-edged sword, though. It's helpful if you're able to take it all in and process it accurately, but it can also be overwhelming, causing the mind to shut down entirely. The easier dungeons in this game are a bit more accommodating to that reaction, but if you try to run through the Water Temple on autopilot, you will quickly find yourself tangled up in its complexities.
The Water Temple is rewarding for a player who pays attention and moves around deliberately, but it harshly punishes a player who, for whatever reason, misses certain details. One tricky detail is in the central tower, where a wooden platform hides a hole in the ground that becomes accessible when the water level is raised, taking the wooden platform up with it. That one is pretty easy to miss, but it's not nearly as bad as the hole hidden underneath one of those blue blocks that disappears when you play the Song of Time, which is embedded in the ground behind the treasure chest where you obtain the Longshot. Unlike the hidden hole in the tower, the hidden hole in the room with the Longshot isn't tied to a novel implementation of the dungeon's central gimmick. It's simply a test of your ability to intuit that there's something hiding behind a treasure chest. I also find myself wondering how many players miss something as simple as the cracked wall that you can see as you rise up to the first panel that changes the water level. This isn't very likely, is it? When you enter the room where you reunite with Princess Ruto, you're facing the direction of that cracked wall. Take off the iron boots and you'll float right past it. Even if you are facing the wrong way initially, it takes so long to float up that you are bound to turn around and see it at some point, right? Well, the truth is that you can never guarantee any player behavior through game design. All you can really do is poke and prod and nudge and hope that they'll get the idea.
The problem in the case of the Water Temple is that any failure on the part of the player to understand what the dungeon is poking and prodding and nudging them about will result in the player having to exhaustively sort through every single room that they've already gone through in order to figure out if there's something that they have missed. It's important then to analyze the design of these spaces not just in terms of what it would look like to go through them efficiently, but also what it looks like when a player makes mistakes. The water temple provides ample opportunities to make mistakes, and in turn, that means that all the little annoyances of the water temple are magnified, as the player has to deal with them more times than is strictly necessary.
The annoyance of equipping and unequipping the iron boots in order to slowly sink to the bottom or slowly float to the top is well known. So I would also like to point out some other underrated annoyances. A pervasive one is the need to deal with the respawning enemies. Even under ideal circumstances, you have to return to the central room multiple times. And every single time, the spike balls and the hopping bugs are back. Those two enemies, called spikes and tektites respectively, are pretty easy to deal with. But then there are also a few bouts in different rooms with a type of enemy called a shell blade, which are essentially clams with sharp teeth. I mentioned them briefly when I talked about the Gerudo training ground, but they're most prominently featured in the water temple. These guys have a brief window of vulnerability where they expose the soft tissue under their hard shell before they leap at you to attack. If you're trying to hit them with the hookshot, which is likely given that they usually appear underwater where the hookshot is the only weapon you can use, you will almost definitely take a few hits from them because you fired slightly too early or slightly too late because of a lack of visual feedback on when they're vulnerable. These enemies are all over the water temple, usually in tight spaces where they're impossible to avoid. There are also plenty of little one-off things. I really hate the hallway leading off of the western side of the bottom level of the central room. There's a drop-off into a pool of water. In order to get back up, you can't simply unequip the iron boots and float to the top. I always do that by reflex because that's how you usually get up to a higher level in the submerged parts of this dungeon. But when I do that here, I slowly float to the top of the water before realizing that I needed to use the hookshot to actually get out and back into the central room. Having realized this, I then have to re-equip the boots, slowly sink to the bottom, and then wait for the hookshot to become available to use again after a short delay. Once I hookshot out of the western hallway, I can proceed clockwise to the hallway leading off the northern side of the bottom level of the central room, which is positively stacked with annoyances. The first issue I have is a bit of a nitpick. Progressing through the northern wing requires that you have obtained the upgraded hookshot, now called the Longshot. That isn't a problem in and of itself, of course, but this room just doesn't feel big enough, and the hookshot target on the other side of the room just doesn't feel far enough away to really adequately communicate what you're missing when you don't have the Longshot, or how much of an upgrade that you've received when you do have it. This actually ties into a much trickier problem that I have with the water temple, which is that I don't like that the item that you get here is just an upgrade of an item that you already have. That isn't a problem in and of itself either, but it feels like this was done at the expense of the base hookshot, whose range often feels overly limited until it's upgraded to the Longshot. Moreover, due to the nature of the first-person perspective used when aiming the hookshot, its range is inherently difficult to understand, which makes the upgraded range of the Longshot harder to appreciate. This problem is trickier than the one-off problems that I've listed, because the water temple is entirely built around this upgrade. You're making extensive use of the hookshot all throughout, but big chunks of the dungeon's progression are based around the difference between the range of the base hookshot and the range of the Longshot. Anyway, moving away from that trickier problem back to one-off problems, there are more rooms on the northern wing to discuss. Once you've used the Longshot to cross the gap, you're met with a locked door. Behind this locked door is a room with a big pool of water. The pool of water is fed by two waterfalls on opposite corners of the room, which are drained into two whirlpool pits, creating a current that drags Link towards the pit if he's not swimming fast enough or wearing the iron boots. Boulders periodically roll out of those waterfalls along the floor of the pool and into their respective whirlpool pits. Finally, there are 6 tektites skimming on the surface of the water. This room has a lot of moving parts, but they combine to create a banal challenge. You can try to swim past the tektites or walk underneath them. You will almost inevitably take exactly 1 hit from a tektite in the process of reaching the exit, sustaining little damage but still feeling like you didn't perform the challenge correctly. Don't worry, doing it the right way by slowly picking off the tektites from a distance with arrows or by painstakingly baiting them over to a place where you can hit them with your sword doesn't feel much better. This is a strong contender for the position of my least favorite room in Ocarina of Time, and it's a shame because I find it visually compelling in a subtle way. It's pretty in the same way an indoor swimming pool is, and I like the way you loop back around to this room by getting to the upper level of one of its waterfalls. The process of making that loop involves 2 more challenges. The first of the 2 is a puzzle challenge involving pushing a block onto a switch that raises the water level so you can exit the room. It's simple, but I like the process of figuring out all the different puzzle elements of the room. First finding the switch, diving underwater to press it, and then realizing you have to find a way to hold it down. Where to find such a thing? Oh, there are 2 cracked walls that you can open with bombs, and you can do some roundabout maneuvers to get a block out of the narrow passageway that was hiding behind those cracked walls. The biggest problem I have with this room is that it's filled with these little stingray enemies that are just a nuisance that don't interact with the primary challenge in any meaningful way. After that room, you have to do a platforming challenge where you press a switch to briefly open up a barred door on the other side of a gap, and then cross the gap by hopping across the tops of some high-pressure jets of water. It's a decent enough timed platforming challenge, but having the timed switch be responsible for activating the jets of water and opening up the door means that you can essentially succeed at the interesting part of the challenge by clearing the gap, only to then see the door get sealed, forcing you to restart. The real frustration is yet to come, actually. You exit the room with the platforming challenge and find that you have looped back into the room with the pool of water with rolling boulders and tektites, only this time you're on top of one of the waterfalls feeding the pool. Running against the current, you sink into another small pool of water and have to deal with a shell blade in its native habitat. That is to say, one of the narrow hallways that makes it especially annoying to deal with. Once you've dealt with that, you rise up and are met with another locked door. Hope that you've been diligent about getting all the keys, because if you haven't, you have to search the entirety of the dungeon in order to find it, because by this point you have the entire dungeon available to you to explore, and then you have to deal with the rolling boulders and the tektites and the jets of water all over again. What a pain in the ass.
I could keep going, describing all the rooms in the water temple that have some kind of one-off annoyance. But what I hope I've illustrated through this example is that many of these one-off annoyances are, in fact, things that you will have to deal with multiple times if you're not playing perfectly.
I already mentioned the hole that's hiding underneath a Song of Time block in the room with the Longshot. What I didn't mention is that this room is found behind 2 pretty involved puzzle platforming challenges that you'll have to redo if you weren't observant enough to notice a random detail hidden in an unintuitive way. It is a small mercy then that you don't also have to repeat the challenge that comes after those puzzle platforming challenges but before obtaining the Longshot, the fight against the Water Temple's mini-boss. For as cool and epic as it is that the mini-boss is an evil, shadowy doppelganger of Link, the fight itself leaves a lot to be desired. In theory, I like that there are multiple ways to fight him, but in practice, every method feels like a finicky exploit to some degree or another, even if you take him on in a straight fight, only using your sword and shield, which I've never successfully done, because it seems to mostly involve recklessly swinging until something connects. But hey, huge points for presentation. You enter into this room and find a surreal, infinite landscape blanketed in yellow-green fog, covered in a shallow layer of water, with a sad little island with a single dead tree in the center. You entered through what appears to be a freestanding door to nowhere, and on the other side of the sad little island is what seems to be an exit, another freestanding door to nowhere. But both doors are barred, and as soon as you turn around after reaching the exit door, you discover that Link's shadow has risen up and has been watching him silently for the past few moments. And when he's defeated, the sad little island disappears, and the room suddenly reverts back to being a normal water temple room. The presentation of the water temple is mostly pretty understated, which works pretty well, as it helps keep the focus on the dungeon's big complex navigation puzzle. The mini-boss chamber is the biggest exception, though, and I appreciate that such a cool, evocative room comes out of nowhere the way it does. It's an interesting inconsistency, not a senseless one. I've devoted a lot of time to explaining what makes the water temple frustrating, but this is, overall, a dungeon that I've really come to appreciate. Its frustrations are all in service of its ambitious design. It's Ocarina of Time's most difficult dungeon, but that's because it's the dungeon that relies most heavily on the player's understanding of dungeon design, on the player's ability to internalize the rules of a space and know how actions in one room will affect another. Because of its complexity, it's the only dungeon in Ocarina of Time that I still find rewarding, even after spending almost 3 years exhaustively combing over every aspect of this game. The feeling of bumbling through the water temple is uniquely miserable, because it compounds all the numerous little frustrations by making you deal with all of them even more often, as you repeatedly run through all the rooms and all the different water levels. But at the same time, the feeling of running through the water temple with intention and understanding is uniquely satisfying. It's a space that you can genuinely attain some sense of mastery over, but you can't measure that mastery in obvious ways. The game doesn't keep score, but you can tell you're doing a good job if you've remembered where all the points of interest are, and if you haven't had to go back and forth, up and down, raising and lowering the water level over and over again. And we shouldn't sell this dungeon short. For all its complications, it's doing a lot of work to make itself understood, but you won't find anything so heavy-handed as, say, what you find in the Shadow Temple's Stone Umbrella Room, which I call the Stone Umbrella Room because it features a sign that tells you outright that the solution to its puzzle is to use the Lens of Truth to find a stone to use as an umbrella against a crushing spike trap. Now, I am a firm proponent of the idea that sometimes it's important to simply tell players outright what they need to do, but so much of the fun of a good Legend of Zelda challenge comes from the process of putting the pieces together on your own. Sure, using the Lens of Truth to find a hidden block is hardly an interesting puzzle solution, but it's satisfying to be given an opportunity to figure out even simple things like that, even if the alternative possibility is that the player will get stuck because they don't know what to do. Critics and commentators refer to things like the signpost in the Stone Umbrella Room as moments when the game holds your hand, rather than allowing you the freedom to be confused. I have complicated feelings about the idea of games holding the player's hand. That's a whole essay unto itself. Suffice to say this, even if I personally appreciate some degree of hand-holding, there's no denying the craftsmanship of game design that gives you just enough prompting to figure things out on your own. The Water Temple really does make an effort to give the player the information they'll need to succeed without being overbearing. The dungeon has an understandable structure that's conveyed to the player with uncommon clarity right from the start. All All the different rooms connected to the central room are given some distinctive marking on the outside that sets them apart, like the torches in front of the room where you reunite with Princess Ruto, or the 2 jars in front of the room where you obtain the compass. The relationship between the water level and the tools and routes available to the player always makes sense, and with the exception of the hole hidden underneath a Song of Time block, all the confusing or obscure aspects of this dungeon are expressions of the dungeon's central mechanical ideas. If you're having trouble, it's probably because you have misunderstood or forgotten something about the water level. Sure, this information isn't delivered perfectly, and I will grant that some of that comes down to the limitations of technology and design in 1998, but much of this room for confusion is inherent to the hands-off approach that makes successfully exploring and navigating this dungeon so much more compelling. You can't account for every possible way that a player might get confused, and in fact, the threat of confusion can make the process of making sense of something more compelling. I described the water temple and the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly as the most forward-looking dungeons in Ocarina of Time, the ones that seem to most clearly signal the way dungeons would be designed in future games in the Legend of Zelda series. These are also the 2 dungeons in Ocarina of Time that test the player's spatial reasoning abilities the most, and the ones that are the most willing to confuse the player. This might seem contradictory to those of you in the audience who are familiar with the general critical impression of the games that followed Ocarina of Time, that they doubled down on the hand-holding. Both of these things are true to varying extents. Subsequent Legend of Zelda games would have longer introductions and tutorials, devote more time to unskippable explanations of basic controls, and have more heavy-handed hints about puzzles inside dungeons. But they would also feature dungeons that average out to being much more complex than the average Ocarina of Time dungeon, and sometimes even exceed Ocarina of Time's water temple in terms of complexity. Another big reason that I called them forward-looking is that you can clearly see the way their central ideas have been iterated upon and played around with in later games in the series, in a way that you can't see as much with, say, locks and keys, musical instruments, or silver rupees. So, the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly is built around having a companion help you with puzzles, which we can clearly see as a recurring subject of Legend of Zelda dungeon design. The water temple is built around a big, central set-piece mechanic of raising and lowering the water level, and both of these dungeons have an emphasis on complex spatial navigation that indicates a certain confidence in designing 3-dimensional spaces, which would obviously become even more apparent as the series continued, as the designers became more experienced with working in 3 dimensions.
The water temple and the dungeon inside Jabu-Jabu's belly feel forward-looking because they're the dungeons that most visibly strain against both the limitations of the Nintendo 64 hardware and the limitations of contemporary understanding of 3-dimensional game design. In the process, they are often frustrating, but they also are often inspiring, enthusiastically expressing the imaginative possibilities of 3-dimensional spaces. For all their frustrations, you could say that these dungeons are Ocarina of Time at its best.